More specifically, our today's speakers will present 3 papers on the topic of integrating national commodities and institutions into global value chains. At this point, I want to remind you that this event has received funding from the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation under the second call for research projects to support postdoctoral researchers. Also, I would like to inform you that the video of the first panel is available online. If you have registered for this event, you probably have already received the link. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you our colleagues Ernst Langthaler, Nikos Alexis, and Juan Carmona-Zabala, who are the today's speakers. Professor Ernst Langthaler has a PhD in history from the University of Vienna. He is a professor of social and economic history at the Johannes Kepler University of Linz and principal investigator of the research project Soy and Agro-Food Transitions, Austria, from a multi-level perspective, 1970s, 2020s. Nikos Alexis is a PhD candidate of history at the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Crete. His thesis focuses on the technological unemployment and the question of mechanization in Greece during the early 20th century. He also works for the Institute for Mediterranean Studies. Juan Carmona-Zabala has a PhD in history from the University of California, San Diego. His thesis has a title State Expansion and Economic Integration and Transnational History of Oriental Tobacco in Greece and Germany. He also works for the Institute of Mediterranean Studies as a principal investigator on the project The Value Chain Analysis of Tobacco in Greece, 1949-1981. Very quick, Ernst will present us a paper titled Soy and Agro-Food Transitions, Austria in a Global Perspective, 1970s, 2020s. Maximilian Martsch and Gabriel Tober from Johannes Kepler University Linz are the co-authors of this paper. Nikos will present us a paper titled From National Chains to Global Networks, Competition and Adaptation in the Greek Cigarette Industry, 1950 to 1980. And Juan will present us a paper titled Capturing Value Through Cooperativism, the Cooperative Union of Tobacco Producers of Greece. So, Professor, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I hope you can see the presentation. Okay, so thank you first of all for inviting us to this workshop. It's a great pleasure for us to present yes, the outline of our research project on soy and agro-food change that has started a few months ago. It is funded by the Austrian Science Fund and it's carried out at the University of Linz. Here on this photo, you can see the project team, Max on the right, Gabriel on the Max on the left, Gabriel on the right, and myself in between. This picture gives the impression of plant breeders. Of course, we do not know too much about plant breeding, but we are more interested in observing plant breeders and other actors in the soy web in a historical perspective. So first of all, what is fascinating about soy? And a crucial feature we would like to highlight is that soy played a paradoxical role. It was both a protagonist and an antagonist of the Western mode of living, the imperial mode of living. So on the one hand, soy became the most important animal feed for the meat-based diets. And on the other hand, soy is also an alternative to this meat-based diet in form of tofu, for example. So it's a very flexible agent. You can make many things out of soy, and this makes this crop so interesting to us. On the global scale, we can see that soy experienced a rise from a regional food crop at the beginning of the 20th century to the leading global cash crop at the end of the 20th century. So regarding trade value, soy is the biggest agricultural commodity nowadays. And Austria is a node in this transnational web, a node of both trading and production consumption. As you can see in these diagrams above, you can see the rising soy cake imports from the 1960s onwards, and below the increasing soy production in Austria from the 1980s onwards. Our argument is that soy's rise involved arrangements of knowledge technology, commodity chains, and regulatory institutions in the context of agro-food regimes and their transitions. And in our project, we aim to reconstruct successful and failed shifts of soy from different niches to the mainstream in Austria in its transnational setting from the late 19th century onwards. Now I'm going to outline the two key concepts of our project, namely agro-food regime and agro-food transition. So what is an agro-food regime? In our view, agro-food regimes consist first of commodity chains. So these are connections between locations of production, of distribution, and of consumption. And these commodity chains are dynamic, so they can expand or they can contract. So they have frontiers that move in different spaces at different times. And when commodity frontiers expand, they exploit additional sources of labor and nature. The second element are regulatory institutions, such as the nation state or big companies or social movements that try to define the rules of the game, so to say. And also these institutions have frontiers that move from time to time. And the third and final element is knowledge and technology, also with techno-scientific frontiers. And the relation between these two elements is what we conceive of as an agro-food regime, which is characterized by a specific mode of development. So this is the abstract model. And to make it more concrete, we have different historical expressions of agro-food regimes. In the literature, we find three examples: the British-centered regime from 1870 to 1929, the US-centered regime from 1947 to 1973, and the WTO-centered regime after 1995. The concept comes initially from Friedman and McMichael, who coined the food regime theory. So now to the other key concept of our project, agro-food transitions. Agro-food transitions are a complementary concept to agro-food regimes. Here you can see the horizontal axis is a temporal axis, and the vertical axis distinguishes between different levels. So on the regime level, we have an agro-food regime consisting of, as already stated, commodity chains, regulatory institutions, and knowledge technology. And at some times, trends and shocks from the wider context, from the so-called landscape level, intervene. So they put pressure on the regime. For example, economic crisis or military conflicts or climatic disasters. And they can induce a crisis of the regime, and they can also open windows of opportunity for socio-technical innovations emerging in specific niches. So at this moment, a regime could restabilize itself, or it could be destabilized and go into a transition from which a different regime emerges that is also in relations to trends and shocks from the landscape level and socio-technical innovations from the niche level. Okay, so far the abstract model. Concrete historical examples for such transitions are first the classical liberal transition before 1870, so the emergence of a free trade world market with nation states that establish this market. Second, the state protectionist transition in the Great Depression from 1929 to 1947. And third, the neoliberal transition from about 1973 to 1995. The concept was coined by Giels and his colleagues, transition theory or multi-level perspective. Okay, now I'll hand over to my colleague Max.
Yes. So let me now turn to the questions regarding our periodization. So we are combining the global scale of the food regime chronology with a more grounded scale of specific national episodes. And we have so far identified 4 episodes regarding the introduction of soybeans into Austria. And our national episodes supplement the succession of the different food regimes by focusing on phases of instability, crisis, and transition. You can see that here on the picture. And even though these phases are actually crucial for the understanding the structures and the functioning of individual regimes, they are still a blind spot or the blind spots in food regime literature. So with our case study, we not only contribute to the existing literature, we are also trying to shed some light on how regimes were dealing and reacting to external and internal pressure. The episodes that we have, they also define our project's workflow. So we are 2 PhD students, me and Gabriel, and we are each responsible for 2 episodes. I'm responsible for the first 2, one of which is dealing with the emergence of soy-related research in Austria-Hungary from 1873 until the outbreak of World War I, when soybeans were mostly considered a botanical curiosity, an exotic cultigen from the Far East. The second episode is covering the time when soybeans were mainly discussed as a solution for the worsening nutritional situation because of the ongoing war, and then also the economic and financial distress of the 1920s and especially the 1930s, and at the end of which soybeans were incorporated into the food system of the National Socialist regime during the course of the Second World War. Gabriel is then looking at the post-war era, when soy was starting its global career as animal feed and as an oil plant, thus becoming, as you can say, the fuel of the Western diet. And finally, since a couple of decades, soybeans also play a key role regarding questions of sustainability, climate change, and in general, the future of the food system, meaning nutrition. So, but let's come to an example maybe. How did soy come to Austria? And Ernst already presented the 3 dimensions of regimes, institutions, commodity chains, and knowledge and technology. And assuming that the size of these dimensions and their importance within regimes are constantly changing, they're expanding, they're contracting, they will play a very different role during each of our episodes. And one main aim of our research is to identify the structures of different regimes, their responses to shocks and crises, and also their ability to incorporate new technologies and innovations. And we do consider soybeans to be an agricultural innovation of that time. So these regime niche interactions and the processes of anchoring and linking of different actors in the institution that play an important role when the niche where innovations are developed are still in a nascent form, are still underdeveloped. And this is the case when we turn to Austria and soybeans in my first episode in the late 19th century. So for this time, let's look like this. So for this time, actually, soybeans were not yet considered a commodity, but rather a subject of research. So commodity chains will not play a vital role. It was the beginning of the formation of a soy network based on exchange of knowledge between individual scientists, botanists, and farmers. And the central channels of exchange were interpersonal correspondence, academic publications, and also the media. And you can see 3 examples of these modes of exchange. On the left-hand side, you see the title page of the seminal work by Friedrich Haberland, a pioneer of early soil research in Austria-Hungary. called The Soybean from 1878. Then a visual representation of the soy plant. So drawings like this that were printed in newspapers and also academic publications to educate scholars, but also the public about the characteristics of the soy plant and its various stages of development. So and finally, you see a newspaper article, and at the end of the 19th century, articles about the experiment and field trials with soybeans and their potential benefit for agriculture and also human nutrition that were widely discussed in specialist journals, but also in daily newspapers at the time. So in sum, all of these means of knowledge exchange, they contributed to the consolidation of the soy niche, of the first soy network built of knowledge exchange. So even though I said that commodities don't really come into play at this time, at this early stage, maybe there's one early example in the form of international seed dealers that were working in France and Germany and Italy at the time, and they were starting to trade with soybean seeds as early as the late 19th century. And some of them were involved in field trials. They were multiplying the seeds and then adding their soybeans to the product line. And for example, one of them, you can see it here in the 1894 catalog of the French seed company Vilmorin-Andrieux. We find actually 4 soybean varieties on sale, each of them with a short description on how to cultivate them and how to use them. And these seeds, they could be ordered by mail and were available for shipping all over Europe, also overseas. So you can say that it was maybe an early attempt to establish soybean seeds as a commodity and marketize them to maybe a small audience or maybe a small consumer market, but still they tried to do that. So that's all from my side, and I hand over to Gabriel for the rest.
Yes, thank you. In my part of the presentation, I focus on methods and sources. Our project is based on 5 methodological strategies. The first to address the agro-food system from the landscape and regime levels. Through national connections, we analyze Austria's node of the global soil web and address the ways domestic actors adopt, reject, and reconfigure transnational impacts. We use international comparisons to analyze similarities and differences of Austria and other countries, especially the emergence of soil in the USA and in Brazil, in other South American countries. The last 3 methods adopt a complementary view from the niche and regime levels. The reconstruction of actor networks serves as the main approach to access the dimension of knowledge and technology. The guideline to follow the actors enables us to uncover the knowledge transfer between different actors and networks. We focus on the process of commodification and investigate the links between subnational configurations and global commodity chains. The establishment of commodity chains is necessary for an innovation to break out of the niche existence and establish durable relations in national markets. So what are our sources? We use material from 5 main sources. The first are contemporary printed material like journal articles, monographs, and reports. They present the main sources for critical discourse analysis and actor network approaches. Soy appeared in domestic and international statistics as Austria began to import soybeans between the World Wars. Annual trade and production data of international organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization is an important source to analyze commodity chains of soy. We also collect material from private sources. The Soy Info Center, a US private collection and database, has published historical source books on the history of soybeans and soy food in countries around the world, and one of them is dealing with Austria. Furthermore, we analyze material of Austrian soy companies and different civil society organizations like the Austrian-based NGO Univ Soy. We conduct expert interviews with Austrian soy pioneers who promoted the cultivation, processing, and marketing of soy from the 1970s onwards. From my own experience, speaking with these pioneers, this source provides us with untold stories about soy in Austria. And finally, we collect and analyze documents from public archives, mainly the Austrian state archives. So now I would like to give you a short insight into our sources. I have selected one example of my ongoing investigation in the Austrian state archives about soy-related aspects in post-war Austria. There I have found strong evidence that relief supplies included soybeans, and imports of soybean oil and feed started as soon as 1947, so 1 year before the start of the European recovery program for Austria, the so-called Marshall Plan. As you can see here in the picture, in 1951, the Austrian government supported the import of soybean oil, and their motivation was to overcome the lack of cooking oil and fat. On one end of the chain, US trading firms cooperated with European and Austrian importers to deliver US soybean oil to Austria. And in this example, 400 tons of soybean oil were imported to Austria. On the other end, we see Austrian processing companies in the soap, oil, and margarine industry. They are processing these oils. As other commodities in the Marshall Plan, soy was shipped to the port of Trieste in Italy and then transported by train to Austria. Analyzing these documents, it's possible to trace the beginning of this current soy commodity chain to post-war processes, and we can see an early global soy commodity chain connecting to Austria. I would like to stress that the companies Fritz Martin and Estemann, in the pictures in red, are still important players in the soybean business in Austria. We have now reached the end of our presentation. Thank you for your attention, and we also invite you to follow us on Twitter. Search for soy_change. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving us that very interesting presentation. In short, I perfectly follow your approach, and I strongly believe, as you do, that institutions play a crucial role in determining production decisions, as well as evolution of commodities over time. Through your presentation, you try to investigate the interrelationship among different institutions, technological processes, technologies, and global commodity value chains, giving special emphasis to soy products in the case of Austria. Your presentation makes clear to me that soy seems to be characterized by a strong ability to survive and grow increasingly under different types of regimes. This kind of flexibility you described become much more important when we realize that it's not a very common phenomenon among agricultural commodities. As a last comment, I find really exciting the fact that you choose to work by combining multiple data sources, both quantitative and qualitative ones. A question just to open the discussion. I would like to ask you, what caused soy's product so flexible in the case of Austria? Was it the special nature of this product, some specific geographical conditions, or matching to different institutions that made the product so flexible? If we have other questions, we are open to hear you.
So may I ask a question so that they can answer together, both questions together? So I found it quite interesting that you that in your model or your conceptualization of food regimes or agro-food regimes, you distinguish between regulatory institutions and commodity chains. And I was wondering if we could think of this distinction as historically contingent. I mean, at least to the extent that the state is concerned. So we have periods when the state could both be a market actor, not just a regulator. It could buy, it could produce, it could sell soy or other, well, I don't know about soy, but certainly, you know, other commodities. I'm wondering whether this distinction between regulator and the network of producers is something that is specific to to a specific period of time or specific modalities of agro-food regimes. What are your thoughts about that? Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, a colleague raised a hand. Yes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting project. I think one basic question is you mentioned about the commodity chain. So the object, the commodity is the soya itself. So it's the beans, or it is also related to the cultivation, means the plants and agriculture together. So because interesting for me is from the demand side, when the soya came to Austria, what is the potential market or the demand? Was soya a kind of a substitution of a kind of local product or another kind of imported product and so on? So it's maybe related to the commodification and the knowledge exchange or marketing or something like that. I think it's very interesting, also involved in the cultural sphere because related to religion. Like in the Chinese context, is always related to something could call it the veganism or something like that with the kind of local tradition. So I am really interested in the kind of demand or consumption in the soya culture. Did it trigger a kind of soya culture or a new consumer culture, something like that? Thank you.
Okay, I think there is another question on the chat by Herman. Herman?
Yeah, hello.
Okay, Prof, could you, okay. Okay, so I can read the Herman questions for a minute. You mentioned the paths which soy traveled on in order to be sold and marketed in Austria. So I wondered, how would you describe the significance of the actual physical route of this commodity chain in relation to the supply chain? In other words, why does it matter that it went to Trieste or that it was sold instead Pathnets published in Paris, for example? And another question from Chinosko Henry. Henry?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you have.
I want to thank the organizers for this program, and I also want to thank the guest speakers. But I'm more concerned about the farmers because I know soy is an agricultural product. So I want to ask the speakers, how are the farmers in Austria in respect to soy production? What is the condition of the farmers? How are they faring? How is their welfare? What is happening to them? How is the farmers being able to cope in respect to the planting of soy? So that was my question. I want to know the condition of the farmers the people producing the crops, what is their condition? How is their life, their economic, social, political? And I just want to know about the farmers. How are they coping? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are full of questions. So
yes, thank you for these questions. Let me start with the questions raised by Trifonas and Juan. First of all, Trifonas asked what makes up the flexibility of soil as a commodity. Is it more the natural features or is it more social institutions? My answer would be it's both. So the flexibility of soil on the one hand is a result of its biological features. Soil is exceptional in the combination of protein and fat in the form of oil. So in this combination, soil is unique, and therefore you can produce a broad series of products out of soil. So you can use the protein part, the cake, for example, for feeding animals. You can use the oil for making cooking oil or for making ingredients to industrial products such as soap or ink or paint and others. Very prominent was Henry Ford in the 1930s and 40s. He was obsessed with using soy as an ingredient for producing his automobiles. And he presented in the early 40s a plastic car with a plastic case, and it was very robust. That's the biological side. And on the other hand, institutions play a crucial role as well. So this is the ambition of our project, to combine these two perspectives on this particular commodity. And concerning the question raised by Juan about this distinction between commodity chains and regulatory institutions, I would say it's only an analytical distinction, because in historical reality, both components are interwoven. And concerning the role of the state, it can be modest at some periods. So the state only as an institution that guarantees the rules of the market, but in other periods, the state can play a more interventionist role. For example, in Nazi Germany, Austria was annexed to Germany in 1938. Nazi Germany was very active in promoting soy as a source of human nutrition, for example, for feeding the soldiers of the German army. So the role of the state can shift, and this is exactly what we try to figure out in our project, how the role of the state shifts over periods. So the other questions I would leave to my colleagues. Perhaps Max, you want to answer some of them?
Maybe I can take the next two. The first one was about soy being a substitute, or if there was an early, so I would say, like maybe soy culture in Austria. And that is very interesting, because Austria is very unique when, for example, comparing the development of soybeans to the one in the US, that it was always mainly discussed as food for human consumption. And of course, we know that soy, we always talk about soy, but there's a lot of commodities, a lot of products that can come from the plant, a lot of soy foods and different products that come for industrial purposes and everything. And soybeans were, in the beginning, actually, I would say most of the time considered to be a substitute for something else. When they were coming into focus, it was a substitute for something else. For example, around 1908, there was a shortage of cottonseed oil coming from the US. So there was a discussion here about alternatives. How can we actually close this problem's oil gap? And soybeans were discussed in this sense. And there were first trials with soybeans extracting the oil and importing them. And so in this case, it was always soybeans as a substitute for something else that was working before, but now we have restrictions. And then soybeans were discussed as a substitute for meat or other protein and protein-rich foods during the war times, during this kinds of economic crisis as well. So in the beginning, I would really say that it was always in this case of substitute that soy came about to be discussed also in the media, but also in research when it comes to Austria. And the second one is also like somehow tying into this question is about the different commodity chains, import channels, and also harbors. It was about Trieste, if they actually Trieste played also a role in this value chain. And that Trieste never really played an important role for the import of soybeans. So it was actually just this small time in the beginning when there was this oil crisis that also over Trieste were coming soybeans from Japan, this experimental shipments from Japan, but also soybean oil already from Great Britain, which had experimented with crushing oil and soybeans earlier, that oil shipments came to Trieste. But actually these numbers, we have numbers, import numbers of soybeans and soybean oil at this time, and they were really small. They were nearly neglectable for this time. So Trieste never played an important role when it comes to soybean as an import number. There were always different channels. And we always have to consider in this first period that I talked about, the numbers that with soybeans cultivation and experiments, it was really an experimental phase. There was not a lot of going on. Also these catalogs from the seed dealers that mostly dealt in kilograms and not in tons or whatever. So it was small amounts that were mostly for experiments and for researchers.
Yes.
Yes, I want to answer the question about the condition for farmers in Austria. And we have, first of all, to say that the condition changed over time. And because in the 1980s, Austria had a overproduction of wheat. So soy was like a solution for this problem, and farmers received funding for planting soy. And when Austria entered to the European Union, the conditions changed and cultivation dropped. Now it's re-established because consumers in Austria want Austrian soy because it's not transported from Brazil or other countries. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, the whole team. So we can move to the second presentation. Nikos, Alexis, you have 20 minutes, more or less.
Thank you, Trifonas. Hello to everyone. I have to share my screen. It's okay.
Yes, I can see. I see your slides.
Okay. My presentation focuses on the transformation that occurred in the Greek cigarette industry after the Second World War. Until the 60s, the firms of the sector produced cigarettes filled with Oriental-type Greek tobacco, mainly consumed domestically. About 20 years later, they manufactured various American blend cigarettes filled with Virginia and Berlin. Rather than being an inevitable condition imposed by the international environment, this transition reflects an intentional changes. The firms of the sector perceived the adoption of global patterns as a way to boost their total domestic consumption and an opportunity to improve their exports. According to Coe and Young, one of the central questions that CPN theory has to deal with is why structures like global production networks have emerged and how they are organized. Such a question cannot be answered adequately without the adoption of a historical perspective and by analyzing the initial phase of GPN formation during a period that coincides with the global transition from Fordism to the post-Fordist era. Such a historical direction is evident, for example, in the 2006 essay of Hess and Coe, which focuses on the telecommunication industry, but has a marginal role in Coe and Young's 2015 influential book. It reemerged as a topic in the 2019 essay, where they include in the discussion of GPN some articles referring to the early post-war era, taking into account the limits mentioned above, but also the possibilities it offers. GPN's theoretical and methodological approach seems to be helpful for the investigation of procedures like those that evolved in the post-war Greek cigarette industry for the following reasons. Firstly, we cannot overlook the chronological coincidence. American cigarette enterprises expanded abroad during the last decades of the Fordism era, approximately the same period that global production networks started to gain a prominent role globally. Secondly, the cigarette industry per se constitutes an exceptional example to examine how new GPNs are shaped via the territorial expansion of national lead firms globally. It can also contribute to the investigation and the better understanding of the alternative paths of their initial formation, like licensing agreements or share acquisition. Concerning the Greek cigarette industry, the GPN constitutes a valuable tool for approaching its internationalization process. Terms like strategic partnership seem appropriate to describe the relations that emerged out of the tough negotiations between the Greek companies and the multinational enterprises. The correspondence between those firms indicates multifaceted cooperation, as the licensing agreements led to a more profound intertwining of their interests. An advantage of the GPN theory is its continuous seeking for dynamic approaches based on the role of power and governance. This perspective differentiates it from more static methodologies like the dependency theories. I claim that interdependency instead of dependency characterized the reciprocal relations of Greek cigarette companies with their international partners, at least in the early phase of their interconnection. Lastly, the emphasis of GPN on embeddedness seems very attractive and functional, as it directs toward an investigation of the environment around the lead firms and their partners. The GPNs can affect those environments before their official connection with them. The value chain of Oriental cigarettes was simple. Cigarette manufacturers purchased the tobacco immediately from the farmers and distributed the final product to the retailers. The chain was exclusively national in its origin and direction, as it used Greek tobacco to produce cigarettes consumed in the internal market. The domestic economy was absorbing about 19% of the industry's gross added value, and as cigarette paper and packing material were the only inputs from abroad. As cigarette taxation accounted for about 15% of the total state revenues, the sector was prominent in the interest of the Greek state. The cigarette industry was a private oligopolistic sector, but the government was omnipresent in its affairs. It regulated the price of cigarettes and defined precisely the profit margins of the companies and retailers. The firms could not improve their value capturing via price competition in such a framework. Excluding illegal practices like smuggling, reducing production costs was the only alternative path for improving their added value and profit. Firms could not improve their value capturing by
Nikos,
cutting production.
just a second, if you want to move the slides, because some of
Yes,
the
okay.
participants
Okay,
they
it's
want to check
nine.
okay.
Okay. Okay. Firms could not improve their value capturing by cutting production costs either. The industry could not exert pressure on the suppliers abroad like those of cigarette paper. In addition, packing the Oriental cigarettes was very demanding, not allowing quality cuts. Concerning advertising, its role was central to increasing consumption per capita, promoting new products, and finally, the competition among the companies. The labor cost constituted about 15% of the total expenditures in the early 60s. The diminishing of its share via a policy of staff reduction was supplemented by the increased infrastructure and technological equipment expenditure. As such, tobacco became a central issue. For most of the 20th century, tobacco cultivation in Greece was twofold. On the one hand, export-oriented tobacco reared mainly in the territories.
Nico, excuse me.
Yes.
I think you are sharing the wrong window. Maybe you're sharing the window where you have the PowerPoint file, and then you are looking at the display when you press F5. So you see you see different slides, but the other people see only one. So maybe you can address that.
Oh, why? I don't know.
It's all right. We didn't want to interrupt.
Okay, I changed my slides, and what's the slide you can see now? I'm not sure. I have a slide with a title here, the tobacco for domestic consumption.
Yes, Nico, we have only seen
The
slide
first
number
slide.
1 because you're sharing a different window from the one that you are seeing, because you're seeing the full screen display, and we are seeing the window with the where you edit the file and so on.
Oh, okay.
Right. Now it's shifting. Okay.
It's okay now.
Yeah.
Okay,
Please, go ahead.
but okay. I am fine here. Okay. For most of the 20th century, tobacco cultivation in Greece was twofold. On the one hand, export-oriented tobacco reared mainly in the territories annexed by the Greek state during the 1910s. On the other hand, the country's southern districts grew tobacco for domestic consumption, which varied in quality. During the early post-war period, the price of the domestic consumption tobacco was equal, if not lower, to that of similar quality tobacco for export. The industry's complaints about costs were sparse and mainly intended to press the government to permit higher cigarette prices. From the late 50s, the price of tobacco for internal consumption increased rapidly. The price rise was accompanied by overproduction because farmers resorted to various technical methods to increase their crop yield and income, resulting in the deterioration of the product's quality. The state pressured the cigarette companies to absorb larger quantities, and as such, they accumulated stocks in their warehouses. The tobacco for internal consumption issue became crucial for the industry's sustainability. The government of Ernst tried to regulate it in 1964. It granted the cigarette industry the right to set the price according to its needs without state intervention and reformed the tax system. But those privileges were accompanied by counterweights and limitations. The Minister of Economics at the time characterized the new framework as a state monopoly on tobacco for domestic consumption. It defined stricter regulation on the quantities of cultivated tobacco and the set of its price by the state. As every increase in the cost of cigarettes had to be accompanied by an analogous increase in the price of tobacco, the cigarette industry avoided to reevaluate its products repeatedly. During the early post-war period, the cigarette industry was negotiating with the state and farmers collectively, as seen by its announcements in the press. The sense of unification disappears when we focus on the episodes of innovation that evolved during the following period. What mainly distinguishes those episodes is firstly, the firms seek competitive advantage expressed in terms of time pioneering, and secondly, the immediate imitation of the pioneer by its competitors. Finally, rather than being neutral, this process accelerated the adaptation to new global standards, shaping a phase of preparation for the forthcoming cooperation with global production networks. The introduction of filtered cigarettes constitutes the first episode of the simultaneous innovation in the post-war Greek cigarette industry. Papastratos, which faced fierce competition from Kyranis, was the first domestic company to introduce the necessary machinery for producing this type of cigarette in 1956. In terms of time, its competitive advantage lasted only 2 months. Until the end of the year, just one of the 6 prominent companies did not possess filtered cigarette making machines. On the other hand, the rush of Papastratos enabled the company to sustain a worthy share of the market, at least initially, as it was top on the sales of the new product until the end of the year. Regarding consumer behavior, disseminating the filtered cigarettes was not a smooth and linear process. Their initial success was followed by a downward trend as the smokers became suspicious about the quality of filtered cigarette tobacco. The sales started to rise again from 1963, and until the end of the decade, the filtered cigarettes covered more than half of total sales. If the production of filtered cigarettes was inevitable, the introduction of other international patterns seems more intensive. A second episode of innovation began in the summer of 1963, when Kyranis produced Pallas, the first king-size brand in Greece. 2 months after its launch, the new product covered more than 10% of the total cigarette sales, pressing Papastratos to react and launch 2 king-size brands before the end of the year. The various Greek cigarettes were traditionally distinguished by their blend rather than by features like their size or appearance. Their relative uniformity pushed companies to seek alternative ways of promotion and advertising, such as the decoration of the boxes. However, their flavor and aroma attached smokers to certain types of cigarettes. The traditional Greek cigarette had a flattened shape, was short in length, and was packed in square boxes. As the international patterns adopted widely from the late 50s, the cigarette industry now produced a variety of hybrid cigarettes filled with Greek tobacco but characterized by international external features. Such changes constituted an intermediate step before the following experimentation with the production of American blend cigarettes for the domestic market. The expansion of American cigarette enterprises abroad and the diffusion of American smoking habits worldwide caused a climate of concern in Greece. The angst escalated because Greece had to gradually decrease and finally abolish the duty taxes during the accession process to the common European market. Under those circumstances, the production of an American-style cigarette with a higher content of Oriental tobacco was discussed in the press as an ideal solution. The adherents of this perspective combined a defensive argument with an aggressive one. At first, they highlighted the illegal introduction of American cigarettes from abroad and predicted that such novelties easily influenced Greek smokers. Secondly, they claimed that a mixed blend cigarettes would penetrate the international markets and fulfilled the expectation of export stimulation. According to them, the Greek cigarette industry could not convince foreign smokers to taste its products if it did not comply with their habits and preferences. In 1965, Papastratos launched Old Navy, the first American blended cigarette manufactured in Greece. Its production was a contentious issue as the Minister of Economics demanded its postponement until the amendment of the tobacco issue. In the case of filter cigarettes, Papastratos introduced the necessary machinery even before the government approved the production of a new cigarette. Such a choice pressured the state to accelerate its decision and assured Papastratos a time advantage against its competitors. Regarding Old Navy, the company appealed to the Council of the State, were vindicated. The launch of the new product coincides with optimistic statements about the conquest of international markets, which were not fulfilled for an extended period. In addition, converting Greek smokers to the new product was a long process despite intense promotion and advertising. The pattern of simultaneous innovation appears again in the case of blended cigarettes, although this time evolved slower than the previous examples. Johannes soon acquired the necessary equipment for producing cigarettes with the aroma of Virginia tobacco, but other companies like Karelias or Matsagos did not imitate the two pioneers initially. Whatever the case, adaptation according to international patterns intensified during the second half of the 60s, and cigarette filling modifications followed by wrapping alterations. The same year Old Navy launched, Papastratos collaborated with the German cigarette enterprise Ernst to produce the blend cigarette Aston. As such, a period of internationalization via licensing agreements was inaugurated. During about 10 years, various innovations of the global cigarette industry arrived in Greece. Filtered and king-size cigarettes, American boxes, and lastly, blend cigarettes filled with American tobacco. King-size and the new modes of packaging met significant success from their early steps. On the other hand, the dissemination of blended cigarettes was more demanding as it had to uproot the pre-existing smoking habits and establish a new addiction. Soon after launching their first blend cigarettes, the Greek companies started negotiations with American enterprises to produce international brands for the Greek market. After the previously mentioned arrangement with Ernst, Papastratos started negotiations with Philip Morris regarding a licensing agreement for the Marlboro brand. The bargaining lasted for more than 5 years, indicating the persistence of the two parties on the points of disagreement. The manufacture of Marlboro started in 1975, but Karelia had begun to produce an American brand in the previous year. Karelia was now the second biggest player in the domestic market and collaborated with Reynolds to manufacture Winston. The digital archive through tobacco industry documents contains information about the negotiation between Johannes and Lorillard for the production of Kent. The bargaining started in 1971 and lasted for about 3 years, with both sides persistently trying to achieve a win-win outcome. The correspondence between them indicates that it was not only the market issues to be set. The exact blend of the Greek Kent was also under negotiation. Johannes demanded the most content in domestic tobacco that was possible and proposed changes in the flavor of the cigarette, insisting that the original Kent would not meet the needs and habits of the Greek smokers. The balance between the national and international character of the final product is unknown because the licensing agreement does not describe the composition of the Greek Kent. The adjustment of an international brand with the domestic market needs re-emerged as an issue in the late 70s during the negotiations of Iranis with BAT regarding the licensing agreement for HB's brand production. As Lorillard had abandoned its activity overseas, BAT undertook the production of Kent and became the leading Iranis partner. During the 70s, the position of Iranis in the domestic market was deteriorating. In 1976, the family refused to sell a quarter of its shares to Lorillard, but 3 years later, they seemed eager to sell shares to BAT. During the hard negotiation process, Iranis refused to fulfill the demands raised by the multinational enterprise. The Greek shareholders were not willing to guarantee that BAT would acquire most of the shares in the future. Deviations in estimating the Greek firm's value, combined with BAT's predictions about the Greek market's future, led to the negotiations collapse.
One last minute to close.
Despite its financial hardships, Iranis remained an independent company until its closure in 2006. In the case of Papastratos, Philip Morris repeatedly tried from 1968 onwards to acquire firm shares. It purchased the company just in 2003 after 3 decades of partnership. Regarding Karelia, it rejected in 1995 the last effort of Reynolds to participate in its shareholding. Considering the endurance of cooperation between Greek and international enterprises, the strategic partnership seems an ideal term to describe their relations. Papastratos with Papastratos with Philip Morris, Iranis with British American Tobacco, and Karelia with Reynolds intertwined for at least 2 decades. As such, the Greek cigarette industry participated in the global production networks that formed around the major companies of the sector globally. The exchange of information between the 2 sides and setting goals in common indicates that the licensing agreements were the tip of the iceberg, covering a more profound interconnection behind them. The export of Marlboro in Iraq by Papastratos and Philip Morris' contribution to the Greek company's effort to counter the anti-smoking campaign are examples of the connection's strategic character. On the other hand, licensing agreements constitutes a form of loose connection and as such offers more freedom to the partner of the lead company. The Greek cigarette industry formed various counterweights to the governance and the power exerted by the lead firms, producing a variety of blended cigarettes, except those envisaged by the licensing agreement, diminished the disastrous consequences of a forthcoming decoupling. In the case of Iranis, decoupling coincides with bankruptcy and the firm's closure without having a causal relation with it. On the other hand, the breakup of Karelia's with Reynolds constitutes an example of the partner's ability to form its network after the decoupling. The previous coexistence with a lead firm and drawing of experience from it here matters. GPN theory emphasizes on embeddedness, highlighting the impact that global production networks locally and regionally have. As such, the role of the environment formed around the network and its partners emerges as an issue. In the case of the Greek cigarette industry, the impact of GPN had a time dimension. The adoption of international patterns by the domestic sector before its formal interconnection with specific lead firms exercised pressure toward internationalization. Technology also seems to be a crucial factor in the transformation process, spending significant amounts to acquire the necessary equipment and adjust their production according to the priorities of new products. Domestic companies had no alternative than the amortization of their investments and the best possible exploitation of their machinery. Investing in technological equipment favored international patterns adoption and consequently the convergence with the global production networks. The post-war transformation in the Greek cigarette industry has demonstrated some common patterns of innovation among the firms, but also a less predictable behavior of the smokers. As a result, the passage from the national chain to global networks faced a kind of resistance from below. The slow pace of change in the legislative framework was another retardant factor. The Oriental cigarette dominated the domestic market in 1984, despite the significant developments that have taken place, such as the increased cultivation of burley tobacco in the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And we are sorry for that kind of technical problem. But I hope that we can see the role of Greek businesses in this case, other than providing raw goods. Do you think that Greek entrepreneurs played a significant role in marketing international tobacco to the domestic market? Also, what is the significance of Karelias rejecting Reynolds shareholding? Do you consider this as a domestic rejection of international finance in some way? This is a question from Herman.
Okay. Thank about the question of Tryphonas and the expansion of Greek cigarettes abroad. I have to say that this question goes far beyond the chronological limits of my presentation, because for the most of the 20th century, the Greek cigarette industry, as well as most of the cigarettes worldwide, was organized on a national base. I have to say that is a common phenomenon worldwide, the organization of cigarette industries globally, at least until the 60s. And so we have also examples of the formation of state monopolies around the world and in developed countries like France or Italy in the tobacco sector. And so it was very difficult to export cigarettes in other countries. It was not a Greek phenomenon, it was a global phenomenon until 60s. During 60s, we have a change that is the expansion of American firms, multinational, to become GPN, multinational enterprises. And then this condition changes. And from the 70s on, we have a globalization and upgrading, internationalization of the cigarette industry as a sector. In the case of Greek cigarette industry, the exports abroad escalated only in the 90s, the 1990s, after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, because then opened new markets in the area of Eastern Mediterranean, and the Greek cigarette firms like Papastratos.
Can I speak to collision? Thank you.
Okay, exploited this condition and expanded abroad. So I have to say that it wasn't a kind of failure of the Greek cigarette industry until the 70s, that it was oriented in the domestic market, but it was something that happened then everywhere. Relating the second question, I have to say that okay, I prefer to repeat the question if you can, because it was a little complicated. It had 2 or 3 parts.
Yes, do you want to read it?
But yes.
Okay. When you talk about international...
Hi, it's Renee Bricker. I'm calling to ask if you have some idea when my port escape.
Okay, sorry. So the question is, when you talk about international brands for the Greek market, do you mean German and American companies that use Greek tobacco to sell cigarettes on the Greek domestic consumer market? If so, what would you say the role of Greek business is in the case other than providing raw goods? Do you think Greek entrepreneurs played a significant role in marketing international tobacco to the domestic market? Also, what is the significance of Karelias rejecting Reynolds' shareholding? Do you consider this as a domestic rejection of international finance in some way?
Okay, yes. The Greek manufacturers used both imported tobacco and tobacco cultivated in the country to produce their cigarettes. So they combined both raw materials, internal and also from abroad. And as such, they played a central role via the licensing agreements to the internationalization of the internal market. As I said, they had also the necessity, or they faced the necessity to create or to form some counterbalances, and as such, their relations with GPN were also an antagonistic one. It was simultaneously a connection, a partnership, and also a rivalry. It was twofold. And regarding Karelias, it's a fact that happens after the central chronological limits of my presentation. So I don't have a lot of data and information about that. But I know that after its decoupling with Reynolds, it was very successful in the domestic market and also created a small network abroad in the Balkan countries and Eastern Mediterranean. So its decision to reject this, to reject the okay, to reject the offer of Reynolds favored it in the long run. I don't know if it was enough, but
okay. Thanks a lot again. So I think we are ready to for Juan presentation. So Juan, you have 20 minutes.
Hello, everyone. So let's see. So can you see the slides? Yes? No? Yes?
Yes, yes, we can.
And do you see them change?
Okay, it works.
Okay, good. All right, so hello, everyone. The topic of my presentation is here, capturing value. I emphasize capturing value. We'll discuss this here today through cooperativism, the Cooperative Union of Tobacco Producers of Greece. I will be talking about Greek tobacco and the Cooperative Union of Tobacco Producers of Greece. The acronym is SEKE, so I will refer to it throughout the presentation as SEKE. It was established in 1947. This big, it ended up being a big company, one of the largest leaf trading firms in the country. I will be talking about Greece's most important export commodity, which was not cigarettes. It was tobacco leaf for the production of cigarettes in other countries until the the 60s, 70s, when industrial manufacturers became more prominent in Greek foreign trade, in Greek exports. It has a particularity, this firm, of being an anonymous εταιρεία, which I don't know exactly how to translate, but I think we could say a limited liability company. I have to look into the best way to translate this, but it's a limited liability of company of sorts owned by agrarian cooperatives. And this is important because agrarian cooperatives were highly regulated by the Greek state from the 1910s. And this was the first company of this sort owned by agrarian cooperatives. In fact, it was not clear at the beginning whether this was legal at all. And I'm pointing this out because this is, from the very beginning, we're talking about a new type of institution in Greece. So why is tobacco important? For the Greek economy, it was a very big share of the economy before World War II, and it was expected to play an important role in the reconstruction of the Greek economy after the war, after World War II and the Civil War. It was expected to bring a lot of hard currency so that it could be used, this currency, for buying basic stuff that Greek people needed at this time. We're talking about grains, clothing, and also for funding the industrial development, which, of course, at this time, development was understood as industrialization of a country. It had a high level of state interventionism. So it's an interesting commodity to look at because of the many things that are going on around it in terms of the state, different stakeholders, the farmers, the tax revenue for the state, the trading firms, the foreign cigarette manufacturers. So I will get into why that should interest you, even if you're not a Greek historian, in a minute. I have a series of claims to make about all this. First, and very generally speaking, is that the empirical finding is that SEKE contributed to the creation of value in the Greek tobacco sector after World War II, and to the retention of such value by farmers. This is important because I am interested, for me, because I'm interested not only in how much stuff is produced or exported, but also what the consequences are for the local population, whether they can retain part of the value that they produce as opposed to the value being appropriated by other actors. I have a series of historiographic claims that are derived from this. They have to do with Greek historiography. Since we have an international audience today, I will not get into detail with this. We have circulated the paper, it's there, you can look at it. About the methodology, I am using a framework, a theoretical framework known as global production networks. I will not discuss it in a lot of detail, but I will just mention some important points. In this understanding of the global economy, or the globalizing economy, development is understood as the combination of the economic assets of a region being connected to broader transnational networks of production and trade and consumption. But that's not enough. Also, value needs to be captured within a certain location, so that we're not just talking about increased production of stuff or higher quality or more efficiency, and at the same time in the impoverishment of the people doing that production. Development is not just that, it also involves multiple industries, not only one, but this is what matters for this story today. Value can be captured depending on the circumstances, and those circumstances involve certain connections between firms. So firms need to be connected in a way that allows local firms to build up their capacity, to not be dependent upon the other company, and also specific connections between firm actors and non-firm actors, that is the state, trade unions, interest groups, and so on. These connections require that organizations at the internal level also conform themselves or inform themselves in certain ways. So there is an internal evolution that goes together with these connections that happen transnationally. And last value here, of course, the connection between, or the relationship between a commodity and its value is something that has been discussed at the very least since Marx. Here, value is conceptualized as being something different depending on the people that you're looking at. So when we are looking at value creation here in this approach and in the research that I'm doing on tobacco, it is not how much tobacco contributes to GDP or what price it gets in the international markets. It is something different for different stakeholders. So for parts of the state, it could be tax revenue. For farmers, it could be an income, but not only. It could be an opportunity, for example, to stop being a farmer. You can send your kids to do something else after, making some money with tobacco or something like this. And I claim that we need to understand these things to understand what's going on and why things happen, not just, are things efficient or inefficient at the macroeconomic level or at the firm level. I will get into the empirical part of all this in a minute. But my claim, or the theoretical or methodological claim, is that the GPN framework, the Global Production Network framework, can be applied to parts of the globalizing economy in the context of, let's say, Fordism. I don't like this term, but I mean the post-war developmental state. That is, I say this because this theoretical construct was originally created to study phenomena from the at least 70s onwards. Let's say the neoliberal or WTO regime, the post-oil crisis regime, any way you want to call it. But I claim that parts of this theoretical toolkit are useful for earlier periods too. Quite briefly, the context after World War II, Greece has a big tobacco problem. First of all, the sheer destruction of the places that produce tobacco, that is the most important product for the Greek export trade. We're talking about houses of farmers being destroyed, farmers not having shoes, farmers not having enough food for the next couple, for after the next couple of days, relying on external aid. Also, the problem was low prices. The farmers were not able to negotiate prices that would allow them to survive. They were really selling at a loss. When that happens, you very quickly stop producing whatever it is that you're selling at a loss, because you have to go, find something to eat or find some income. So you will emigrate, you will protest, you will ask for help, but it's not sustainable in the long run. That means for no hard currency flowing into the country because there's no tobacco to be exported. So this was considered a problem by the state, but also by the organized interests of the tobacco sector. Our related problem was the scarcity of credit. There was inflation, there was scarcity of banking deposits, and also the scarce credit was allocated by the central government, which was supervised by basically the Americans and the British. And last, but also very important, the foreign cigarette manufacturers that bought most of this tobacco were no longer buying tobacco in the free market. They would make programs. I want this much tobacco of this kind and this much of this kind from this place at this price max. Now I send an agent and he has to execute that buying program. That means that the merchants that would buy the tobacco and, let's say, absorb the risk of taking that tobacco somewhere else, selling it, waiting for maybe a year or two until it gets sold at a good price, they were out of the game. They were not securing credit, and that meant that you have less buyers for the same amount of tobacco. So that and the scarcity of credit are related to the low prices being paid to the farmer. So in the middle of all this problem, SECE, this organization gets established in 1947. I should say that this was this thing of having a tobacco trading firm that would export directly, that would be owned by agricultural cooperatives, was an aspiration that was already expressed in the interwar period. Here we have a speech or some rally of sorts of an agrarian party. Here, the person who is speaking is Alexis, an agrarian leader already in the interwar period. He was at the forefront of this creation of this new firm. So how does this firm owned by cooperatives help solve the problem of, let's start producing and exporting again, but in a way that is sustainable for farmers? This changes over time. In the first period, the first couple of years, what this organization does is attract credit for tobacco trade. So it presents itself as, we are not a for-profit operation any more than is absolutely necessary to be viable. We're going to redistribute profits among farmers. And this allows them to present themselves vis-a-vis the government as worthy of having access to credit in preferential terms. So whereas other firms would get only 80%, 90% of their purchases financed through credit, mind you, allocated through centralized approval, SECE would get 100% for sometimes also at a lower interest rate. Also, SECE would be the advocate of the tobacco workers in government committees, even in the negotiation of international trade agreements. This is also something that helped shape the tobacco policies. It was the speaker on behalf of the farmers. Later on, it was excluded from this role. Here, I should point out that we have an interesting, we mentioned in our last week, Professor Langthaler referred to the actual physical properties of the commodity. There was a debate in government circles. You have the organized interests of the merchants saying, you guys need to produce better tobacco of better quality so that it can be exported. And then you have SECE saying, no, it's all a matter of relations and how it is being negotiated and the institutional arrangements about it. It has nothing to do with the quality of tobacco. That's why farmers are poor. So that distinction was actually part of the debate at this time. So when the state decides that things can't go any further, that it has to step in and buy tobacco directly, that allocating credit is not enough, buy tobacco from farmers because they can't make it through to next year. SECE becomes an agent of the state. It buys tobacco on its behalf, and later on it will also sell it abroad. This was seen with great dismay by the tobacco trading firms because they saw this is unfair, this unfair competition. You have this cooperative organization with preferential access to state resources, putting us out of business or threatening to put us out of business. Some years later, SECE was excluded from this role after a lot of, let's say, lobbying by the tobacco trading firms. And what we have instead is the National Tobacco Board. I have it here in the last line of this slide. This is a state agency that would be, state-owned, independent from particular interests, supposedly. It would equally give or, place orders with agrarian, let's say, cooperative and institutions, but also with, let's say, pure commercial firms. So SECE sort of was able to help the state out of this impasse until it could put together its, let's say, state agency. Also, this collaboration allowed SECE to build up its own capacity. So in the first years, it's buying a lot of tobacco on behalf of the state as a share of its business. Later on, it's just a little bit of tobacco, and then it's not tobacco at all. Here we have an image of the members of employees of SECE with the first tobacco bale that they put together and got ready for sale. It's SECE is written on it. This is how tobacco was packaged at the time. So that was during the first years. Some years later, SECE acquired a very important role as a market opener in the socialist bloc. For some years after World War II, Greece had no commercial relations with the Eastern Bloc, and when it did start, it was through a very convoluted system called the private exchange system, idiotικές ανταλλαγές, where a Greek firm would have to exchange Greek products for products from the other country, in this case, from socialist countries, and then sell them within Greece. So it would have to get then, let's say, Soviet agricultural machinery and then sell it in Greece. Most firms were not interested in getting into all this mess, but SECE did, and it played an important role in opening up these markets. Doing this required creating new partnerships with new companies, with other companies, also creating subsidiary firms. So this, it started as a company owned by cooperatives of tobacco farmers, opened a subsidiary firm to sell trucks. It opened another subsidiary firm to sell agricultural machinery. And I will show you in a minute the share of the trade with these countries. I think it is important to note that SECE never created new situations of monopoly, because one of the claims often against agricultural cooperatives is that, okay, well, yes, you increased trade, or you bought the produce and sold it, but you created a new monopoly and everybody has to sell it to you, and farmers are worse off in the end. This never happened. In fact, SECE helped create opportunities for other actors to get involved, and this is what is called, in the GPN framework, relational upgrading. That means that not only do you increase trade, but you also create new relationships on better terms with a larger variety of agents and export countries. That allows you to get better terms of trade, that allows you to capture more value than when you're exporting to a limited amount of partners. All this was limited, of course, by the westward orientation of Greek trade policy. The SECE and other organized tobacco interests wanted to get preferential tariff treatment for industrial goods from Eastern Europe. They were never able to do that, to get that, because that would have threatened the relationship of Greece with the Western bloc. You know, if we give a tariff rebate for Soviet machines, we have to give the same to Germany and so on. Now, I will not look at all the countries, but I will look at a few of them. So East Germany, here you have this blue square, shows how much tobacco SECE exported on each year. So we see that in many years, it is the highest mark. We have the dot, this circle, purple circle. This is refers to other companies that don't have their own mark. So, for example, we have this red one that's only 2 years, then it disappears from this market. We have this green one, Jordanoglu, a couple of years, it disappears. Now, that doesn't mean that we have an oligopoly. When we have, for example, this here, you see 1952. In 1952, we have this relatively high dot representing other, but we see that the average of those other firms is very low. It's this cross here. So that means that we have many firms exporting small amounts of tobacco. So SECE plays this leading role, sometimes in some years almost a solitary role, like in 1958 here. But it never crowds out the market. In the case of Poland, it's also interesting. Here you have SECE is the only one that is present throughout the whole series from 53 to 66 as an exporter of Greek tobacco to Poland. In some years, we have a lot of tobacco exported by other companies. Here, it's represented with this, if you look at the years 65, 64, 65, 66, it's this light blue triangle. SECE is producing much less, is exporting much less than other, but other, when you look at the average, which is this black thing, these two triangles, this other average is very low. So you have SECE goes from being the only exporter the first time, also being the only exporter in 59, to having a more diversified set of exporters towards the end. So SECE plays this role when it is a very difficult situation with the private exchange system to open the markets, create these connections, and later on we have more exporting firms involved. We have a similar situation with the USSR. I will not get into detail. It is explained in the paper. You get the idea. So as in upgrading the relations of, or the connections of the Greek tobacco producers with the rest of the world economy, SECE played an important role. Also, there is another way in which SECE helped farmers retain part of the value that they created. First, let me say a word about bureaucratization. So in the first years, SECE, in its, advice, let's say its directive, board of directors and its decision-making mechanisms, you had to be a tobacco farmer. Later on, we have former directors of tobacco trading firms. We have people from the political parties who get involved and start running partially SECE. This is often seen as, well, you know, here you have the same people again taking charge of things and getting these very nice salaries at the organization, and farmers are being, at the end of the day, exploited by what ends up being just a commercial operation, just like any other. That might be true to some extent. We cannot say for sure how much of this bureaucratization was justified by the needs of the organization to have connections with the business and political world, the need to have highly qualified people in charge. What we do know is that at least part of the profits were reinvested in the farmers' sons. So SECE funded a series of scholarships in the there were hundreds of recipients. It also built a dormitory for the children of tobacco farmers who would go to study in Salonika. And we see that it funded many economics and business degrees for the sons of tobacco farmers, and then it hired them as employees of SECE itself or of its subsidiary companies. This is a time in Greece in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Well, my study goes until 67, when having a degree of this kind really opened many professional doors in Greece. What was not guaranteed is that the son of a farmer could actually fund his studies, right? So often when we discuss the development of the rural economy, we're talking about increased output or higher prices. But when we look at farmers, sometimes retaining value is actually that his son is not going to be a farmer anymore. And we cannot disregard that, I claim. So this allowed some sons of farmers to move up to, let's say, white-collar jobs in the tobacco sector. It allowed others to step out of the tobacco sector and get jobs, white-collar jobs in other sectors. So here we have a picture of the scholarship holders of SEKE, a picture from the 60s, I believe. Trifona, how much time do you still have?
You have 2-3 minutes.
Okay, good. So just to conclude and sum up, so SEKE emerged out of the combination of a cooperative movement that already existed in the interwar period, but also the post-war conjuncture of the need to urgently bring money to the farmers. It couldn't be in the form of direct, welfare payments. It had to be, let's buy their tobacco, and the need to justify the allocation of more credit in better terms for the tobacco sector. It contributed to value creation within the tobacco sector by attracting credit through its particular character. We are not really here for the profit. We are trying to help, and this created a political leverage to access credit in better terms. It's created value through advocacy that, at different times, its input helped create more favorable legislation for farmers, and also stimulating production, of course, by increasing the income of farmers. And it also contributed to the capacity of farmers to capture value from the commodity that they produce through advocacy, again, by pushing up prices, redistributing profits, relational upgrading, as I pointed out, and also opportunities for other jobs other than being a tobacco farmer. That's all for today. Thank you. Here, it's my email in case you want to ask anything later on, but also here, I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. A short comment. In most cases, at least within the mainstream context of analysis, we are almost totally restricted in a situation that tends to highlight negative rather than positive consequences of cooperativism. In this sense, I truly believe that it's important the fact that you gave us an alternative approach toward farms cooperative associations by reporting and describing their positive effects on many different dimensions. Through this paper, we see that SEKE was responsible not only for supporting farm incomes, but also for giving access to new markets for the product, creating new jobs, even for non-farmers, and financing education. In other words, SEKE was found to be effective and efficient in 2 dimensions, according to my view. First, in terms of negotiation skills for getting higher prices at the market, and of course, supporting farm incomes. And second, in terms of its significance to work the overall modernization processes that took part in post-war Greece, even including human capital development. However, I have 2 questions I would like to answer. Can we say that SEKE was much more related, much more closer to the state's interest rather than those of farmers? And what about tobacco quantities were bought by the SEKE? Did they only have a role to support farm incomes, or they also used for extracting future trading profits? That's my questions. And of course, if we have some more questions, we are ready to. Okay, Herman. Something. Can you read, Juan, or do you want to read it, or?
You don't need to read it out loud, Trifona, so everybody can see it. So I will just read it. Okay. Maybe we can let the other people ask.
Yes. Yeah. We have so Herman text, and we have 2 more questions. Professor Langthaler, okay.
Yes, Juan, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I especially found important your claim that we should look at how or at what value means for different actors. And especially you mentioned these investments for the children of the farmers. And on the photo at the end of the presentation, we saw many young men, but only very few women. So had it a gender bias? So was this investment only for sons or for daughters as well?
Okay, thank you. And there is another question from our colleague Chinosco Henry, if I remember. Henry?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. I want to thank the speaker for a good presentation, but I have some gray areas, and I want him to shed more light on it. I actually read his paper, and I've also listened carefully to his presentation, and I discovered he painted a very positive and a one-sided figure or one-sided narrative about Seke. And as an historian, I believe as an historian that there is no monocausal approach. So I'm a bit curious. Was it that when Seke was in Greece, was it all about positive news? I'm not trying to project maybe they didn't do very well or something like that. No. But I want to know, apart from their good side, at least the Seke as a cooperative institution was run by human beings. And I believe that no human being is perfect. So I also want to know, in as much as I've gotten to know about their strengths, I want to know about their weaknesses, because that will help me to be able to balance my argument. So that's my first question. You have told us their strength. I want to know the weakness of Seke in Greece during this period. And I also want to ask, during your presentation, you painted of some kind of economic situation that was not healthy during that period. And I want to believe that before Seke came, the farmers were not idle. What was it that they did to ameliorate their situation before Seke was established? What was it that farmers did to make sure their situation was a little bit better before Seke took over? And in page 9 of your presentation, you state the goals of Seke, and I want to know how far have they gone in respect to achieving these goals that you discussed about in your presentation. And lastly, what are the reaction of
Excuse me, Chinoso, I didn't understand. I couldn't hear the last question properly. Can you please repeat?
Yeah. I was saying that in page 9 of your presentation, your paper, it's not in this power slide presentation. The paper you sent, the page 9 of it, you state the goals and objectives of Seke. And I'm a bit also curious. I want to know how far have they gone in achieving, or how far did they go then in achieving their goals and objectives? And if they were able to achieve these goals and objectives very well, how were you able to measure that they were able to achieve their goals and objectives? Was it that you interacted with the farmers, or was it that you interacted with their members to be able to adjudge that Seke was able to meet what their goals and objectives at that particular period of time? And finally, I want to know, farmers were the members of Seke. What was their reaction? Was it that farmers were, because the Seke was like from the picture you painted about Seke was like a cooperative institution. So, and I believe that part of a cooperative institution should be the way the members of that cooperative institution project what the organization. So, how was farmers reacting? What was the reaction of farmers to Seke? And another thing I quickly want to point out, you also made us to understand that Seke was like an advocacy group. And from my own orientation, I know government does not go down well with advocacy groups like that. So I want to know, what was the relationship between Seke and the government in Greece in that particular time? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let me go one by one. So let's say about sons and daughters. I should point out that we're talking about a time when it was sort of taken for granted that the families would invest more in the education of male sons. of male children rather than female. I would like to point out that in Greece at this time, it was also common that women would get married with a dowry. So the families also they already had to invest anyway in daughters so that they could get married. So I'm not saying it's fair or unfair, it's just how it was. In this sense, it is not it is a pattern when you look at who studied at this time. There are some women. I think there was one in the picture. I looked at the catalog after almost 20 years. There were very, very few women. So that one also. SECE and states' interests. Well, it changed, how SECE's interests and state interests were related, changed over time. It looks, well, in the first years, as I said, there was a convergence of interest. The state wanted to buy, or the government wanted to buy tobacco. This idea was backed by the Americans, by the British, but the state didn't have the means to do it. So SECE did. Later on, SECE doesn't have this special relationship to the state anymore. I should say that some of the high-level directors of or managers of SECE, or some of the ideological proponents of SECE, end up being in the government. So, for example, Alexandros Baltazis, who I showed giving a speech earlier on, ended up being Minister of Agriculture with the Central Union in the 60s. There were other times, by the way, when it was tobacco trading firm directors or owners who became ministers of agriculture. So the tobacco sector is often represented in the state. It looks like the Center Union was closer to the SECE leadership than the right wing. Now about quantities and Trifonas. What was your question? I didn't get it very well. Trifona.
Okay. What about the tobacco quantities were bought by the SECE? Did they only have a role to support foreign incomes, or they also used later for extracting future trading profits?
Yeah, there were years when SECE was exported more tobacco than anybody else, or bought up more tobacco than anybody else. So it was, some years it was actually the most important firm, other than the foreign cigarette companies. It did pursue profit. It did distribute it, sometimes, not always. And this connects with actually with Chinoso Henry's question of, what is the dark side, or what was not so great about SECE. There was a critique very often that SECE would actually not really help push up prices, that too much money was being spent in bureaucracy, and that it ended up that farmers were still poor at the end of the day compared with other occupations, and I think that criticism makes a lot of sense. But I think that we cannot pass judgment on whether, generally speaking, it was good or bad, because we don't have the data, and it is a bit of a counterfactual question, like what would have happened if SECE had not been there. And I hope I'm not airing my own incompetency here, but I really think that operationalizing success or measuring success in absolute terms is very difficult. I did focus, I admit, on the positive side, but this is related, I think, with the state of the art in Greek historiography that is often very negative about the cooperative movement. So that's why, I tilted towards the side of being positive. But yes, there was criticism leveled at SECE. What else? Farmers were not idle before the establishment of SECE. No, they were not, of course. But the thing is, many of them were simply not producing tobacco. They were either producing food, but often still dependent on aid by UNRWA or by the Greek government. Let's keep in mind that the farm that tobacco farmers had available to them was usually insufficient as a source of food. It's not like they could pivot to, let's say, wheat and then have enough bread or something like that. Many of them were emigrating to the cities and adding to the social problems in the cities. And in many cases, we don't know what they were doing. It seems clear that production fell greatly. So they were certainly not growing tobacco, many of them, or they were growing tobacco in part of the farm, other things in other parts of the farm. How many farmers were involved in seke? So I can't remember the exact numbers, but I will say that it had to be in the tens of thousands of members of the cooperatives that owned seke. Now, a different question is how much of a say, of a direct say, the farmers had on what seke was doing, because seke was also a limited liability company. So the board of directors, where non-farmers would sometimes, were sitting after, I think it was year 53, but I'm not sure. They were not really members of seke. They were members of the cooperatives that owned seke. And this brings us again to the question of the negative side of all this, that farmers could sometimes disagree with what seke was doing. I will say, though, that I have not seen any protests, any farmer protests against seke, whereas they would protest against other trading firms. So at least if that is a measure of farmers being kind of okay with the situation, it's not a perfect measure, but it is better than nothing. And about seke, the government, I think I have answered that. Herman asks, there were attempts to create agricultural cooperatives in the Ottoman period as well, but these attempts were slowed by the fact that merchants and peasants were both involved in the deliberation processes. They came to some sort of agreement, which was mostly oriented towards reconstructing credit markets for the benefit of Muslim merchants and peasants. The end of the Ottoman rule changed the situation for obvious reasons. What's the significance of this agricultural cooperative in channeling credit back into the tobacco market, and how did they guarantee fair terms of credit arrangements? Okay, you mentioned that seke presented themselves. Well, it was yeah, so it was credit allocated by the under state supervision. Seke presented itself as willing to redistribute the profit among farmers after exporting the tobacco. This it did for some years. Also, it promised to pay high-ish prices to farmers. So that's what kind of justified politically giving better access to credit for seke. Now, the fairness of credit arrangements was not, I mean, because credit was highly regulated, this was not really something that seke guaranteed. Seke did not allocate credit to farmers. The agricultural bank did. This was highly regulated. For example, in Greece, you could not lose your land because of debt. You could lose your tobacco, you could lose your raisins, but you could not lose your land. It was also supposedly lower interest rate, but again, that was regulated by the agricultural bank. So seke channeled credit into commercial credit into the tobacco trade, but not it did not give credit to farmers. That was a bit of a different story. I think I've covered everything, unless somebody wants. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much. So if there is not another question, I would like to thank you for your participation, presentations, questions, comments, and of course for the discussion. Next panel next week is about governing commodity chains across state boundaries. I'm sure that you will receive an email as a reminder in the case you want to participate. So I hope to see you again next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. See you next.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.